November 12th, 1944, late autumn in Texas. The war was still raging across Europe, the Allies pushing through the Hurtgen forest, the German army bleeding in the snow. But here, halfway across the world, another chapter of that war was unfolding in quiet dust and sunlight. The trucks arrived just after dawn. Their engines coughed through the cold morning air, spitting grey fumes that mixed with the earth. Dust rose around the convoy like smoke from a battlefield no one could see. The men inside did not speak. They sat in that resigned stillness that comes after long transport, weeks of movement without destination, days of waiting in darkness and motion. They had crossed oceans to arrive here, from the captured fields of Normandy to holding camps in England, from there across the Atlantic in the bellies of ships that reeked of oil and fear. Now, after rail lines that stretched endlessly through the American heartland, they faced something unimaginable, captivity without cruelty. The trucks halted before the wire. A line of guard towers watched over them, their silhouettes sharp against the pale Texas sky. Beyond the perimeter, barracks, mess halls, laundry sheds, everything arranged with unnerving precision. It looked less like a prison and more like a small, disciplined town. Heinrich Müller stepped down from the truck, his boots sinking into the fine gravel. 24 years old, former infantry cook from the Ruhr. His uniform hung loose. The fabric carried the smell of salt, smoke, and months of sweat. He blinked against the brightness, a squint that made him look older than he was. Around him, the men were silent, faces hollowed by exhaustion. The only sound was the clatter of metal tags and the soft jingle of canteens. The guards moved among them, giving brief instructions in calm, clipped English. No shouting, no rifle butts, just procedure. Then came a smell that broke the rhythm of everything. At first faint, barely there, but unmistakable. Cornbread, sweet, buttery, baking somewhere beyond the fence. Heinrich lifted his head. The scent floated toward him, absurd and disorienting. He had not smelled sweetness in months. His stomach tightened, not from hunger, but confusion. Somewhere, a kitchen was working, and its comfort crossed the barbed wire as effortlessly as wind. He thought of home, Essen, before the bombings. His mother's bakery, the scent of rye loaves on cold mornings. That smell had once meant safety, belonging, purpose. Now it arrived in enemy territory, resurrected by strangers who might never know what they were giving. The prisoners were lined up and counted. Medical officers glanced into mouths, checked wrists for disease, noted ranks and ages. An American sergeant marked Heinrich's number on a clipboard and moved on without a word. It was all routine, impersonal, efficient. The absence of humiliation unsettled him. He had been prepared for vengeance, for scorn, for the righteous fury of the victors. Instead, order, civility, the quiet hum of a well-fed camp. He glanced toward the mess hall again. The smell persisted, mixed now with coffee and the faint metallic tang of kitchen steam. Around him, others noticed it too. Eyes darted. A few men exchanged nervous half-smiles, the kind born not of comfort, but disbelief. The sky hung low, colorless. The flag on the pole cracked sharply in the wind, red, white, blue, colors that once meant the enemy and now marked the boundaries of his new world. As the gates closed with a dull final clank, Heinrich stood still, his hands trembling just slightly. Behind him, the engines faded into distance. Ahead of him, that impossible scent still lingered, stubborn and bright against the barren air. And in that moment, beneath the Texas sun, he felt the war shift inside him, not through violence, but through something far stranger, the warmth of bread, baking somewhere beyond the fence. The line moved forward with the sound of gravel crunching under worn boots, a rhythm both mechanical and human. The prisoners were told to remove their overcoats and form ranks in groups of 10. There was no barking of orders, no rifles pressed to their backs, only gestures, calm and precise. The Americans spoke a language Heinrich Müller could not fully understand, yet the tone was unmistakable. Efficiency without cruelty. The sun climbed higher, pale and dry. The light revealed everything: the torn seams of uniforms, the grime beneath fingernails, the hollow cheeks of men who had spent too long on trains that never stopped long enough for rest. The camp stood still around them, a geometry of order, fences glinting in the light, watchtowers silent, barracks lined like equations. It was not beauty that struck Heinrich, but coherence, the strange peace of a place that functioned. An officer walked past holding a clipboard, his steps deliberate, his shadow cutting across the line of prisoners. He stopped at each man, scanning faces, noting numbers stitched into tunics. "Name?" he would ask. The interpreter, a German-American sergeant, repeated the question in their mother tongue. Name, rank, unit. Heinrich answered in a dry voice, words barely audible. The officer nodded and wrote without expression. No insults followed, no spitting, just the scratching of pencil on paper. Next came the medical inspection. A tent had been set up near the gate, white canvas glowing in the sunlight, almost holy in its cleanliness. Inside, the prisoners were told to remove shirts. A young medic examined their arms, checked for lice, lifted eyelids to inspect for infection. Heinrich felt the sting of shame more than the chill of air on his skin. The medic's gloves brushed his shoulder, not roughly but professionally, and that small civility felt unbearable. He remembered a winter in Poland when he and his unit had searched through the frozen ruins of a village, their hunger sharper than their conscience. He had looked into the eyes of people who feared him, and he had not cared. Now, standing half-naked in the American tent, he wondered if this was what they had seen, the face of a man who thought himself righteous while obeying orders. The memory burned behind his eyes. Outside the tent, a corporal handed each man a towel and a bar of soap. "Shower, then issue clothes," the interpreter said. Heinrich stared at the bar, smooth, white, fragrant, and for a moment it did not register as real. In Germany, soap had become a rumor, something one bartered for with cigarettes or bread. Here, it was given freely, almost thoughtlessly. The showers hissed with clean water. Steam rose in the cold air, turning the fenced yard into a pale fog. Some men closed their eyes as they washed, as though the sound itself was sacred. For the first time in months, the grime came off easily, layers of dirt, oil and defeat sliding down the drain. Heinrich felt lighter, but not cleansed. The body was easy to clean, the conscience less so. When they emerged, towels around their necks, an American guard pointed toward a table stacked with folded garments. Clean undershirts, socks, and canvas work clothes, all labeled with numbers. "Temporary issue," the interpreter said. Heinrich reached out and touched the fabric. It was coarse, but new. The smell of soap still clung to it. For a moment he hesitated before putting it on. The act felt like erasure, shedding not only the dirt of war, but its meaning. Around him, the others did the same, transforming from soldiers into something undefined. Not free men, not slaves, just human beings suspended between identities. The inspection ended with silence. The officer with the clipboard gave a final nod. The prisoners were told to proceed to the mess hall for their first meal. The word echoed strangely in Heinrich's mind. Meal. It sounded too generous, too domestic. He felt an ache in his stomach that was not hunger, but apprehension. As the line began to move again, he looked back toward the tent, the towel still damp in his hands. He felt clean, yes, but also exposed, unarmored. The Americans had stripped him not of dignity, but of the necessity to hate. That, he realized with quiet dread, was the most dangerous disarmament of all. The mess hall stood at the far end of the compound, its wooden frame bleached by the Texas sun. As Heinrich Müller walked toward it, the scent that had haunted him since morning returned. Stronger now, no longer a phantom, but a tangible promise. Roasted meat, bread, something warm and seasoned. His mind refused to believe it could belong to them. The prisoners shuffled forward, their footsteps slow and uncertain, as if entering a chapel rather than a dining hall. The guards did not hurry them. No batons, no rifles pressed to backs, just the steady motion of men too dazed to trust the absence of fear. Inside, the light was brighter, white bulbs hanging from beams, illuminating long rows of wooden tables. The floor was clean. The air, thick with steam and food, carried no trace of rot or misery. It was the scent of order. The sound that filled the space was mechanical and rhythmic. Spoons striking metal trays, ladles scraping pots, plates sliding across counters. Heinrich found himself at the end of the queue, clutching the tray they'd given him outside. Shiny aluminum, heavy in his hands. He studied it, as though it might dissolve at any moment. Ahead of him, prisoners received portions from American kitchen staff, some soldiers, some civilians. There was laughter among them, casual, unforced laughter. When his turn came, he froze. The American sergeant behind the counter, tall, broad, with a clean face and tired eyes, pointed with his ladle. Next. Heinrich stepped forward. A spoonful of mashed potatoes fell onto his tray with a soft thud, pale and steaming. Then came a thick slice of meatloaf, dark brown at the edges, glistening with gravy, green beans, bread, and finally, to his disbelief, a square of golden cake, sugar dusting its top like frost. He stared. It was obscene, impossible. This could not be for prisoners. For a second, he thought the guard had made a mistake. He looked up, ready to correct it, to return the tray before the punishment came. But the sergeant only nodded toward the tables. "Go on, Kraut. Eat up." His tone was flat, without mockery, routine. Heinrich moved away slowly, as if carrying something fragile. Around him, men whispered under their breath. Some laughed, nervous laughter that broke off quickly. Others kept glancing toward the guards, expecting the order to stop, to take it back, to replace the feast with the ration they deserved. None came. He sat at a long wooden bench beside a fellow prisoner from Bremen, whose eyes were fixed on his plate as though hypnotized. "It's a trick," the man muttered. "They want to break us." Heinrich said nothing. His fork trembled in his hand. The first bite was cautious. A piece of meatloaf, chewed slowly. Salt, fat, warmth. The texture was soft, unfamiliar after months of bread crusts and thin soup. The taste seemed to move through him, confusing every instinct. He waited for nausea, for some inner rebellion of pride or fear. None came. Only silence inside him, vast and hollow, as if something sacred had cracked. He ate without looking up, each mouthful both relief and humiliation. Around him, others did the same. Men, devouring in silence, as though they had been starved not of food, but of permission to feel human again. When the dessert came, he hesitated. The small square of cake glowed under the light. He cut a piece, brought it to his lips, and the sweetness nearly hurt. He swallowed, eyes closing briefly. For the first time since capture, he felt tears threaten, not from sadness, but from something more dangerous, recognition. The room was filled now with the soft clatter of trays, the scrape of cutlery. No one spoke loudly. The noise was domestic, almost gentle. The guards watched without concern, as if this abundance were normal, unremarkable. Heinrich looked at the men across from him, faces still wary, but softer, unguarded. The war, for a moment, seemed impossibly far away. He glanced again at the tray, at what remained, crumbs, a trace of gravy, the shadow of a meal that felt like blasphemy. He wiped his mouth, placed the fork down, and stared at his hands. They shook slightly, though not from hunger. He understood dimly that something irreversible had begun. He had expected bars and hunger. Instead, he had been fed, and that kindness, served on a metal tray, felt heavier than any chain. The next morning dawned pale and windless. A sheet of stillness stretched across the Texas plain. A bugle sounded from somewhere beyond the barracks, clear but indifferent, like a sound meant for another world. Heinrich Müller woke to it reluctantly, disoriented by the softness of the mattress beneath him, the warmth of the wool blanket, the absence of fear. For the first time in months, he had slept through the night without the crack of artillery, without the vibration of trains. Yet the peace unsettled him. When the guards opened the doors and motioned the prisoners toward breakfast, the same disbelief returned, sharper now, no longer protected by exhaustion. The mess hall waited for them again, steaming in the morning cold. From its open windows drifted the smell of coffee, eggs, bread toasted in butter. The air carried it shamelessly, as if it were not a scandal to feed the defeated. Heinrich's stomach tightened at the scent, a reflex of both hunger and shame. The queue moved forward in silence, and when his turn came, the American cook behind the counter, a freckled man with a scar on his jaw, smiled briefly, then filled his tray. Scrambled eggs, bacon, oatmeal sweetened with something that tasted like honey. Heinrich took it without a word, though his hand trembled slightly. At the table, he sat beside men who avoided one another's eyes. They ate as if performing a ritual they did not understand. The sound of forks striking trays echoed faintly through the hall, synchronized, rhythmic, almost ceremonial. Heinrich lifted a spoonful of oatmeal and hesitated. He thought of the front lines, of comrades gnawing at stale bread, of officers dividing frozen potatoes among squads of 20. He remembered the hollow look in their eyes when they spoke of American weakness, of decadence, and now here he sat, tasting that so-called decadence, realizing it was not softness, but abundance, the quiet confidence of those who could afford mercy. The food slid down his throat with difficulty. His body accepted it greedily, but his mind resisted. Every bite felt like surrender. He chewed slowly, deliberately, as if to keep his pride alive between his teeth. Across from him, a young soldier named Kruger pushed his plate away, muttering under his breath, "I can't. It tastes of defeat." Heinrich said nothing, but he understood. He felt it too. The way warmth could humiliate, the way kindness could strip you bare more efficiently than punishment. After the meal, they were told to assemble for work detail. Heinrich wiped his tray clean, carried it to the return counter, and stood still for a moment before leaving. He wanted to thank the cook absurdly, but words failed him. Gratitude felt treacherous. It was not meant for enemies. Outside, the air was sharp with sunlight. He looked at the camp around him, orderly, disciplined, unthreatening, and felt a sickness that was not physical. It spread quietly, beginning in the stomach and climbing toward the heart. He tried to name it, but no German word seemed right. It was not guilt, not exactly shame. It was the dissonance of being treated better by the enemy than by one's own cause. That evening, lying in his bunk, he listened to the sounds of the camp, the distant hum of generators, the murmur of guards talking near the fence. Someone was laughing softly. He stared at the ceiling, hands folded over his stomach, still full from dinner. The fullness itself had become unbearable. He imagined the war continuing across the ocean, the cold, the ration lines, the thin soups and hunger slogans, and he felt a strange betrayal toward those still starving. He pictured his mother standing in line for bread, the grey light on her face. What would she think if she saw him now, fed by those she had been taught to despise? He turned on his side, eyes open in the dark. The warmth in his belly pulsed like guilt. He could not reconcile it. Hunger had been simple. It clarified. It justified. But fullness demanded reflection. It left no excuses. Heinrich whispered into the quiet, not to anyone in particular. Why do they feed us? The question hung unanswered in the air. Somewhere beyond the barracks, a train whistle blew, long, distant, mournful. It reminded him of Europe, of cold stations and empty promises. But here, in Texas, the night smelled faintly of bread, and with that scent came the truth he could not yet admit. He was no longer starving, but he had never felt emptier. The morning sun crept across the barracks floor, golden and indifferent. Heinrich Müller sat on the edge of his bunk, the tin mug of coffee cooling in his hands. It was bitter, strong, too generous a portion. He drank it slowly, staring at the rising steam, letting his thoughts wander backward, back to the grey continent that had taught him what hunger meant and what it demanded. Hunger had been Germany's shadow long before the bombs fell. It was written into ration cards, stamped onto the walls of bakeries, whispered through the streets of the Ruhr. Heinrich remembered standing behind his mother's counter in Essen when he was a boy, watching her weigh. Bread for customers with precise mercy. The scales were her altar, fairness her faith. Each loaf measured against the ache in her conscience. By 1944, fairness had vanished. The bakeries were ruins, ovens cold. The air itself smelled of soot and metal. Hunger was no longer shameful. It was patriotic. Sacrifice for victory, the posters had said. Eat less for the fatherland. He remembered how easily the slogans replaced reason, how willingly they believed that emptiness in the stomach could be translated into strength of will. He had joined the army not out of faith, but inevitability. The uniform was a language he did not question. As an infantry cook, he had learned to make soup out of water and air, to stretch a week's worth of potatoes into a month. Soldiers came to him with hollow eyes, and he learned the arithmetic of desperation, how much hunger a man could bear before he stopped being a soldier and started becoming an animal. He remembered the Eastern Front, the snow, the silence after artillery, the smell of bodies and burning fuel. He remembered boiling horse bones for broth, scraping frozen fat from discarded cans. Hunger had its own hierarchy. Officers first, the rest after. Compassion was a luxury rationed tighter than sugar. One winter, he had been ordered to prepare food for an inspection by a visiting general. He spent 2 days saving scraps, beans, flour, anything that could resemble abundance. The general had smiled, patted his shoulder, and praised the discipline of hunger. Heinrich never forgot that phrase. Discipline of hunger. It meant loyalty through deprivation, obedience through emptiness. It was a theology, not a policy. Now, sitting in an American camp with a full stomach, that doctrine felt grotesque, almost comic. Yet it was woven into him like muscle memory. Each time he lifted a spoon in Camp Swift, he felt the ghost of that discipline watching him, whispering that satisfaction was betrayal, that fullness was weakness. He stared into his mug, the coffee reflecting a trembling sliver of sky. The taste was foreign, but his body had already begun to crave it. Hunger was fading. What replaced it was more dangerous. Doubt. Later that day, while chopping wood for the camp's lumber detail, the rhythm of the axe brought more memories. Mechanical, brutal. Each strike called up faces of men who had died with their mouths open, dreaming of bread. He had thought of them as heroes then, martyrs for a greater cause. Now he saw them differently, victims of an empire that had confused starvation with virtue. That night, as he lay awake, Heinrich recalled the propaganda reels they used to watch before the war. Bright films showing German families at long tables, mothers ladling soup, children smiling beneath banners of plenty. He remembered how he had believed those images, how they had made hunger seem noble. The irony stung. Here in captivity, the enemy provided what the Reich had promised, but never delivered: food, warmth, dignity. Each meal was a refutation of everything he had been taught. He turned toward the barracks window. Beyond the wire, the horizon shimmered in the dying light. Somewhere, a dog barked, and the faint smell of bread drifted again from the kitchen. It mingled with his memories, until he could no longer tell which was past and which was present. In Germany, they had told him that hunger would make him strong, but it had only made him obedient. Now, full and captive, he felt the first tremor of rebellion, not against the Americans, but against the lie that had governed his life. By the end of November, the shock of arrival had dulled into something stranger: routine. The days at Camp Swift began to stack one atop another, neat and identical, like loaves cooling on a bakery shelf. Each morning, the bugle called. Each afternoon, the sun pressed its white hand upon the barracks roof. Each evening, the men ate until they could no longer pretend they were starving. It was a rhythm of excess that confused them, a mercy too predictable to distrust, but too alien to accept. Heinrich Müller began to mark time not by weeks, but by meals. The clang of the mess bell had replaced the thunder of artillery as the measure of his existence. At first, he went to eat cautiously, tray in hand like a supplicant approaching an altar. But soon his body learned what his conscience resisted, that the food would always be there. Bacon, coffee, boiled potatoes slick with butter, slices of soft white bread. Every day, abundance repeated itself with the same calm certainty as sunrise. The work details filled the hours between meals. Heinrich was assigned to the lumber yard, sawing planks for the camp's maintenance. The Americans worked beside them without hostility, exchanging gestures, the occasional joke. There was an unspoken agreement. As long as the work was done, the wire remained merely symbolic. The guards watched, yes, but they did not sneer. They chewed tobacco, squinted against the sun, sometimes even handed out cigarettes. The war felt faint here, like a distant radio humming through static. Yet beneath that calmness, something uneasy began to grow, a guilt that had no language. It appeared during lunch breaks when the men unwrapped sandwiches made from real bread and thick slices of cheese. Some ate quickly, hunched over, as though the food might be taken away if seen. Others laughed, though their laughter sounded brittle, too loud. Heinrich often sat apart, eating in silence, his eyes fixed on the way the sunlight struck the dust in the air. It looked almost holy, this ordinariness, this daily abundance. At night, the prisoners spoke softly among themselves. The conversations circled around the same paradox. Why feed us like this? Some said it was a trick, a way to make them complacent. Others believed it was a performance for the Red Cross. Heinrich wasn't sure, but the longer the abundance lasted, the less he cared to explain it. The body's memory of hunger began to fade, replaced by something heavier, gratitude that felt like betrayal. Letters home were allowed once a month. Heinrich stared at the thin blue paper, the pre-printed lines for censored correspondence. "I am well," he wrote. "We are treated fairly." He hesitated, the pen trembling above the page. How could he describe the truth, that he, a prisoner of war, ate better than his family in Essen, that he had milk in his cup while his mother boiled water for soup? He folded the letter without finishing it, sealing silence inside the envelope. Winter crept closer, though Texas knew little of real cold. Some mornings brought frost, brittle and brief. The camp kitchens produced oatmeal and hot coffee, and steam poured from the mess hall doors, like breath from a living creature. The smell filled the compound, settling into the clothes of the prisoners, until it became part of them. Even their dreams changed, no longer of battle or escape, but of tables and plates and warmth that asked for nothing in return. And yet Heinrich noticed how the fullness never reached their eyes. They were fed but restless, clean but uneasy. The camp, for all its order, had begun to feel like a mirror, one that reflected their old selves, stripped of all illusion. What stared back was not the proud soldier, not the patriot, but the simple, undeniable human being, hungry once, now fed, free once, now confined, once certain, now quietly ashamed. In that fragile balance between comfort and captivity, Heinrich began to understand that survival was not always victory. Sometimes it was merely the privilege of living long enough to feel remorse. The days continued, indistinguishable yet heavy with meaning. Food, work, sleep, food again. Routine, the quiet mercy that tasted, more and more, like confession. The wind carried the smell of onions and grease that morning, drifting through the wire like a message. Heinrich Müller paused in his work, the axe hanging loosely in his hands. He had been splitting wood for the kitchens, the same dull rhythm for hours, swing, crack, stack, the sound echoing across the yard like a heartbeat. The scent from the mess hall reached him between gusts, onions sizzling in fat, something frying in oil. It was familiar and foreign all at once, the smell of labor and warmth, the smell of home reassembled in enemy hands. When the noon whistle blew, Heinrich and the others set their tools aside. The guards leaned on their rifles, talking idly. The men filed toward the fence that separated the work area from the kitchen wing. There, through the open window of the mess hall, Heinrich saw him again, the American cook. He was middle-aged, stocky, with rolled sleeves and a sweat-stained cap. His name, stitched above the pocket of his uniform, read R. Hall. The prisoners had noticed him before. He moved with the authority of someone who understood his craft completely. He didn't shout, didn't hurry. His ladle was an extension of his arm. Heinrich hesitated before approaching the window, the air shimmering with heat and scent. The cook turned, noticed the group of German prisoners lingering by the fence, and called out in a low, good-natured drawl, "You boys hungry already?" A few men laughed nervously, unsure whether to answer. Heinrich stepped closer, enough for his shadow to fall across the window frame. "We work for food," he said in broken English, his accent heavy. Hall grinned. "Everybody works for food, soldier. Doesn't matter the uniform." He turned back to the stove, stirring a pot with a long wooden spoon. The smell deepened. Garlic, beef, salt. Heinrich could almost taste it through the air. He wanted to ask something. Why they fed them so well, why mercy came disguised as routine, but the words refused to form. The cook, sensing the silence, said, "We got regulations. Each man, same portion. You, me, even the guards. No one goes hungry." Heinrich frowned. The concept seemed absurd. Equality had never been part of his vocabulary. Hunger had always been a ladder, officers above, soldiers below, civilians beneath them all. Here, in this fenced-out fragment of America, the ladder seemed to have been dismantled. You don't hate us?" he asked finally. The question came out quieter than he intended, almost childlike. Hall looked up from his pot, eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger, but thought. "Hate?" he repeated. "Nah, war's up to the big men. We just make sure folks eat. That's how we keep sane." He nodded toward the prisoners' trays stacked on a nearby table. "If we stop feeding, we start becoming what we're fighting. That's how I see it." The words landed with the weight of something sacred. Heinrich nodded slowly, though he barely understood the full meaning. Still, the tone pierced through the language barrier. It wasn't pity. It wasn't superiority. It was something closer to moral clarity, the quiet insistence that decency itself was a kind of weapon. A guard called them back to work. Heinrich lingered for a moment longer, watching Hal ladle soup into a row of waiting pots. The cook's movements were simple, unceremonious. yet there was reverence in them, a sense of ritual. Each portion the same, measured not by rank or worth, but by need. As Heinrich turned away, his mind churned with confusion and awe. The Americans didn't have to be kind. They could have starved them, humiliated them, avenged their dead. Instead, they had chosen order, fairness, mercy that expected nothing in return. It was, in its own quiet way, terrifying. That night, lying in his bunk, Heinrich replayed the cook's words. If we stop feeding, we start becoming what we're fighting. He didn't yet understand America, nor freedom, nor even forgiveness. But he understood hunger. And now he understood the strange dignity of those who refused to weaponize it. In his dreams, he saw the fence again. On one side, the enemy who fed him. On the other, himself, still learning what it meant to be human. The Texas winter came softly, with cold mornings that dissolved by noon. Frost shimmered briefly on the barbed wire before melting into dew. The days had settled into an uneasy peace, the war in Europe reduced to rumor and radio static. In Camp Swift, life continued with mechanical gentleness, drills, meals, work, rest. Yet inside Heinrich Müller, something refused to settle. He had grown heavier, though he ate less now. His body no longer starved, but his conscience had begun to feed on itself. Each meal felt like confession, a daily reminder of how far he had drifted from the man who once believed suffering was proof of virtue. One evening, after roll call, he sat on his bunk with a single sheet of paper before him. The Red Cross had delivered fresh stationery for prisoner correspondence. The guards handed it out like medicine. 1 page per man, 1 chance per month to speak to the world beyond the wire. He stared at the page, untouched. The others were already writing, pens scratching, sentences forming out of silence. I am alive. We are treated well. Do not worry. All the safe phrases required by censors. But Heinrich's hand refused to move. He thought of his mother. Her letters had stopped weeks ago, perhaps from lack of postage, perhaps from the bombs. He pictured her standing in the ruins of the bakery, hands dusted with ash instead of flour. He imagined her reading his words, words describing buttered bread, hot coffee, laughter. The thought made him ill. How could he tell her that the enemy fed him more kindly than his own country ever had? He dipped his pen in ink, hesitated, and began. Liebe Mutter, I am alive. They treat us. He stopped. The next word wouldn't come. Well, felt wrong, obscene. He crossed the line out, tried again. They treat us humanely. That too was unbearable. He tore the page in half and stared at the fragments on the floor. Across the barracks, men were sealing envelopes, folding their guilt into polite sentences. One man read his letter aloud, his voice trembling. We are fed, Mother. Too much almost, but I would trade every plate for one of your loaves again. Laughter followed, thin, nervous, like the sound of glass cracking. Heinrich didn't laugh. He looked at the torn paper on the floor and felt something tighten in his throat. The act of writing had turned into an act of betrayal. Silence felt cleaner. He stepped outside, into the night air. The camp was quiet except for the low hum of a generator and the whisper of wind through the pines. Above him, the sky was a vast black ocean of stars. Indifferent, immense. Somewhere, music drifted faintly from the guards' barracks. A swing tune, distant, foreign, carefree. He stood by the fence, watching the faint light spill from the kitchen windows. Even now, at this hour, he could smell bread baking. The scent was steady, unashamed. It made his stomach ache, not from hunger, but from memory. He thought of Sergeant Hall, the cook who had said they fed the prisoners to remain human. Heinrich finally understood the cruelty in those words. Mercy demands the recipient to carry it forever. It creates a debt that cannot be repaid, only remembered. He whispered softly, "To no one. They have forgiven us before we've even asked." The words sounded strange in his mouth, foreign, fragile, almost blasphemous. When he returned to his bunk, the torn letter still lay on the floor. He gathered the pieces, folded them neatly, and tucked them into the pocket of his uniform. Not to send, but to remember. In the weeks that followed, he would sometimes take them out, tracing the broken lines with his thumb. They became his prayer, his confession, words that could not cross the ocean because the truth they carried was too heavy to bear. And as Christmas approached, he realized the war inside him had changed shape. It was no longer between nations, but between shame and grace. And it was one he was no longer certain he wanted to win. The new year arrived without ceremony. The sky was pale, the wind sharp, and the camp seemed quieter than usual, as if even the fences had learned fatigue. By January 1945, the war in Europe had turned decisively against Germany. The prisoners knew it not from official announcements, but from the tone of the guards' conversations, from the softened way they looked at them, from the silence that followed when someone mentioned home. Heinrich Müller rose early that morning. Frost rimed the window of the barracks, a delicate web of light. He sat for a long while before dressing, his fingers tracing the edge of the pocket where he kept the torn letter. He had stopped trying to write home. Some truths, he realized, could only be carried, not spoken. When the bell rang for breakfast, he walked slowly to the mess hall. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and fried potatoes. The same smell, the same room, yet it felt different now. Quieter, weightier. Inside, the prisoners lined up as always, trays in hand. The American cooks moved with their practiced rhythm, scooping, serving, moving on. When Heinrich reached the counter, Sergeant Hall looked up and grinned. "Morning, Müller," he said, his drawl familiar now, almost friendly. "Big day today, huh?" Heinrich frowned. "Big day." Hall nodded toward the far wall, where a small notice had been posted in English and German. It read, "Selected groups for repatriation beginning this week. Prepare personal items." For a moment, the words didn't register. Repatriation, going home, freedom, or something like it. The sound of it was dizzying. Hall spooned scrambled eggs onto his tray. "Word is, you're on the list," he said. "You'll be out of here before next week." Heinrich stared at the food, golden, steaming, then looked up again. "And after?" Hall shrugged. "After? You go home. You eat your own cooking again." But the word home no longer carried the same shape it once did. It had become a ghost, something distant, uncertain. What did home mean to a man who had learned humanity from his captors? He sat at his usual table and ate slowly. Around him, men whispered, their faces alive with disbelief. Laughter rose, cautious at first, then louder. Yet Heinrich remained still, tasting each bite as though memorizing it. The food was simple, eggs, bread, coffee, yet every flavor seemed alive with meaning. He looked around the room, the guards leaning casually by the door, the steam rising in soft columns, the clatter of cutlery, the muted hum of human peace. This hall, he realized, had been his classroom, its lessons served on trays of mercy. When he finished eating, he remained seated long after the others had gone. He stared at the empty plate before him, tracing its rim with one finger. It struck him that this was how endings often came, not with fanfare or forgiveness, but with silence and a full stomach. He thought of his mother again, of the bakery in Essen, the dusted counters, the smell of bread rising. He imagined himself back there, weighing loaves with the same precision she had taught him, each portion fair, each hand given its share. That was the kind of order the Americans had shown him, not dominance, but balance. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to fade, the prisoners were called to formation. Trucks waited beyond the gate. Heinrich turned once more toward the mess hall. The building glowed faintly in the dusk, its windows spilling warm light into the cold air. For a moment, he imagined stepping back inside, just to breathe it in again, the scent of food, of forgiveness disguised as ordinary kindness. Instead, he stood still, committing it to memory, the echo of laughter, the hiss of coffee poured into mugs, the steady rhythm of the cook's ladles. Every sound, every smell, the small mercies of captivity. When the gate finally opened, the wind carried a faint sweetness from the kitchens, cornbread again, just like the day he had arrived. The same smell that had once felt like mockery now felt like benediction. Heinrich climbed into the truck. The engine started, the camp receded, and with it the wire, the towers, the flag. In his pocket, the torn letter pressed softly against his chest. He looked toward the horizon, wide, bright, mercilessly open, and whispered to himself, "They fed us so we would remember." And he would. For the rest of his life, he would remember the taste of mercy, the quiet revolution of a full plate offered by an enemy who refused to hate,